Stories are interactions. Interactions not just between the individual elements that make up plot, setting, and theme, but most importantly, it's an interaction between you, the observer, and the story itself. Howdy folks, Anatoly Aster here, someone with just a little bit too much time on his hands. And when I'm not using that time obsessing over the same things I did 9 years ago now, I usually obsess over some more recent stuff, like narrative breakdowns. Because when you have all this time to think about things yourself, instead of letting an algorithm designed to capitalize on instant gratification do all the thinking for you, you tend to come to your own conclusions, like the title of this video. But before I subject you to that insanity, there's something all of y'all need to understand, in that there really isn't such a thing as a superior storytelling method. I didn't make this video to convince you specifically that RPGs are peak storytelling. I made this video because I love stories. Especially thinking about why I love stories. And the point of this video is to give you something to think about too, so that you can earn a deeper appreciation for the kinds of stories you love. So what? That's it? The title's misleading? I don't actually believe a word of what I'm about to say? Well, no. I do sincerely believe that RPGs are peak storytelling. It's just that the title Why RPGs are Peak Storytelling for their exemplary interactions between author and observer didn't sound as snazzy, so I'm gonna stick with the other one. Besides, internet folks just love a title like that one, especially the ones just itching to prove me wrong. But that's my problem, folks. I don't say the things I believe are right, I say the things I believe. And I believe RPGs are peak storytelling, specifically for what they're able to accomplish in immersion, choice, and engagement. But just remember, when I say peak storytelling, that's not synonymous to best medium of storytelling, or the only medium of storytelling that matters. Storytelling and their mediums are aspects of stories as a whole, and when you take the time to pick apart each medium, you'll find that each one is able to accomplish different things in better and unique ways compared to others. A film may convey greater emotional impact as opposed to a novel because you get to see the faces of the characters in the moment, things like that. A live stage production is no different from a movie production when it comes to the storytelling, but they're still different mediums because one exists in the moment while the other is readily reproducible. And to understand just what the RPG does so well in storytelling, we first have to look at immersion. Immersion is the end-all be-all when it comes to storytelling. It's the reason why we have advice like show don't tell. It's the reason why some mediums of storytelling are better suited at doing certain things. It's the relationship you have with the story, how it draws you in, makes you care, places you in the world that these characters are experiencing, and lets you experience that world with them. Because when a person sits down to enjoy a piece of fiction, they know for a fact that it's not real, that these characters don't exist beyond the words, pixels, or pictures strung together by some authors. And you know what? That's not the point. A story's job isn't to take reality one-to-one and essentially give you a second life to live. A story picks apart at elements of reality to rearrange them into something simpler, something easier to understand. Because reality is naturally complicated. So when you have a snapshot, a single piece, a brushstroke of what makes up the bigger picture, it's usually easier to get a message across. But before that can happen, a storyteller obviously has to make their audience care for that message. They have to offer them something. They have to offer something for them to invest in. Oh yeah, baby, that's step one of immersion right there. An investment is exactly what you're doing right now. It's the attention you give to something, the time you took out of your day to stay a while and listen. And because the audience invested their time, the storyteller has to reward them with something. They can't just dump their message in a single thesis statement on a piece of paper. That's not a story, that's a fortune cookie. So how does investment work? How does a storyteller supposed to reward their audience? Well, they always have to keep in mind what they want out of a story. They want an escape, a look into a more interesting or exciting world. Number two is they want to feel or think about things they wouldn't ordinarily experience in reality. Or number three, they want to relate their experiences in reality to something else in order to feel validated or vindicated in some way. And this can be accomplished through a variety and combination of having an interesting central premise, plot setting, or endearing characters. But the absolute priority that storytellers have to remember is making their audience feel like they're a part of that world. Because when you feel like you're a part of something, when you feel like you're involved in something important, your investment is going to return tenfold, 100-fold with the emotional and intellectual response a story evokes in you. That is how you end up caring for what is essentially a bunch of words, pixels, or pictures strung together. And this applies for every single storytelling medium, but What the RPG does so uniquely in this regard is, well, if the goal is to make the audience feel like they're a part of these worlds, then what easier way to do that than giving them a degree of control over them? As, in order to feel like you're a part of something, shouldn't you be able to affect it as well? And this is the greatest strength that not only RPGs, but video games as a medium is able to offer you in storytelling. Because it's quite rare that it lets you participate. It's quite rare that a story lets you influence the outcome of events. And in a storytelling medium that allows you this degree of control, your investment is going to be drawn largely from the consequences of your actions. Those consequences being the effects you have on the characters, the world around them, and how they deal with the conflict and resolution arising from said actions. And personally, the attachment one could develop with these characters is the most powerful tool in investment. Not only do you follow these characters through their every trial and triumph, but you're the one responsible for bringing them there. You're the one who drove a knife into the enemy, solved the puzzle to move forward, defeated a boss to end the chapter, and inevitably the one responsible for saving or dooming their world. And from that, you'll end up caring more for the story simply because you were a part of it. You won't just be rooting for these characters, as in some capacity, well, you end up becoming them. Because people want to point at the characters in a story and go, they're just like me. They want to project their emotions onto them. They want to feel like they're being represented in a significant way. And how traditional media makes you care for these characters is neither wrong nor inferior in any way. It's just that with the RPG, it's easier to form that attachment because you were a part of their story. So great! That's all well and good. That's a wrap, folks. We're done here. Believe it or not, that's the end of an RPG's strong points when it comes to immersion. That's because we still got steps 2 and 3, and with steps 2 and 3, not only does the RPG fall a little flat with some of these aspects, but it's also just not the right medium to be applying said aspects. What, you thought I'd only have good things to say about this whole thing? Well, listen folks, when you love something, you gotta learn to love the whole thing. Not just the good parts, flaws and everything. But let me tell ya, even when other mediums are better suited for believability and stimulation, I still hold RPGs near and dear to here. So don't tune out just because I might say something you wouldn't enjoy about your favorite stories, because if I really wanted to say something you wouldn't enjoy, I can do it a whole hell of a lot worse than what I'm about to do now. You wouldn't want to see me when I start writing a strongly worded letter. I might just bust out the therefore, henceforth, and forthwith. So enough of the vague writing threats, let's talk about some of the RPG's shortcomings, starting with the simpler of the two, stimulation. That's the 5 senses. Most of the time with stories, that's sight and sound, but who knows? I wouldn't mind living to see the day where all 5 senses can experience a story, and with the way things are going, I have a funny feeling we're getting real close to that. Storytelling started with the art our ancestors produced of their lives, which developed to oral tradition and then to rudimentary writing. And the medium of video games is known as a natural evolution of storytelling, as written print is to oral tradition, or perhaps theater is to film. And while each medium stimulates their own senses in their own right, I believe that more stimulation does not necessarily mean greater immersion. In fact, I would claim that even when a video game is capable of audiovisual and occasionally tactile input, there is no medium more stimulating than writing. Hey, whoa, slow down there, pal. Isn't that just sight? Barely sight even, as it's not so common to have pictures in a novel, and all you're doing is reading words. There's no dialogue, there's no cutscenes, there's no soundtrack. How could that be stimulating? Well, stimulation isn't just the sensory input you receive from a story, but it's also how you process it. When left to its own devices, the mind makes its own connections. It paints its own pictures, composes its own sounds, its own feelings, tastes, and smells. And as a writer, I may be biased in saying this, but if I were to seriously dig up the intellectual value in a story, I would prefer to read about it. Reading lets you use your own imagination, which is something I feel a great many people neglect these days. For nothing that exists in reality will ever be as powerful as what the mind can produce, as even in the face of overwhelming empirical and observational evidence, reality is what the mind says it believes. And in the RPG, there is very little room for your imagination to flourish, as most of the time everything is represented the way it is. If I were to make an angelic character, I'd paint it perhaps like this, or this. Your mind sees that and it knows what it represents. But if I were to, let's say, describe it as, their form was human, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings. Each of the four had the face of a man, but on the right side was the face of a lion, and on the left side the face of an ox, and finally each had the face of an eagle. Human hands were under their wings, and the wings of one touched those of another. In among the living creatures, something like burning coals of fire could be seen. They seemed like torches, moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire gleamed, and from it came forth flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw wheels on the ground, one beside each of the four living creatures. The four of them had rims, and I saw that their rims were full of eyes all around. Everyone would end up with different images in their head of what that would look like, but the message is still there. It just appeals to something more primal. And things that appeal to something more primal, well, they're gonna leave a bigger impact. Precisely why believability is so important. As mentioned before, when someone sits down to enjoy a piece of fiction, they know for a fact that it's not real. But you see, there's this beautiful thing in storytelling we all love to refer to as suspension of disbelief, where a person tosses away their critical thought and accepts for just a few moments that the story they're experiencing is real. Why does that happen? Well, number one, simply for enjoyment, as you're not gonna have a good time if you constantly remind yourself that a story isn't real. But number two, and more importantly, it's because that it's not the story itself we believe is real, but it's the things that the story says. Stories have to be believable, because they started out as practical advice or ways to explain the innately complicated and frightening world that humans had to deal with, is dealing with, and will continue to deal with. And I emphasize believable. Believable, not realistic. The difference being, realistic is but a reflection of reality, while believable rearranges all its elements while still maintaining some semblance of sensibility. Because a story doesn't have to be realistic in order to be believable. It just has to make sense. As when it says something that makes sense, then maybe, just maybe, you could learn something from that and apply that to reality. That's what most stories strive to do. Somewhere along the way, past the pretty magic tricks and cheesy cliches, we believe a story not for the unbelievable things that happen in it, but because, well, it tricks us into listening to a lesson about life. But it's hard to relate a story to real life when I'm over here throwing hands with God for the upteenth billionth time with my child protagonist, whose greatest power is not friendship, but their universal ability from keeping their hair from obeying the laws of gravity. And despite all that, they still can't cut down the small tree that blocks the path without MacGuffin number 3301. And right, I get it, not every story has to relate in some way to real life. It could just be a fun old tale to pass the time, but I feel like the writing in every single RPG has to extra compensate if it wants to make its story believable, as it can get entrenched in so many quirks and cliches unique to video games as a medium that the suspension of disbelief kind of just falls apart. It's silly old fun, and it's not a bad thing at all that it's silly old fun, but an RPG, well, it's no less capable of carrying with it moral lessons than compared to a novel or a film. So here's some questions for the ages. What percentage of people is going to seriously apply that story to real life when most people play video games specifically not to be reminded of reality? What percentage more of people is going to listen to the people who do play video games and are saying that these stories can say something meaningful? Because there is a stigma to it. It wasn't too long ago that video games were seen as this devil's concoction that made children more violent. Or like how there's a current stigma in animation where it's seen as, it's just a kid's cartoon, it doesn't have to be a good story. And look, the gaming industry, it's a long way from being this niche nerdy hobby that shut-in, socially inept children are fond of, but it sure is ages away if you want to use it as a device for teaching something in the same way as you would with a novel or a film. It is getting somewhere though, especially with the indie scene, as we've more and more indie developers writing stories with critical commentaries on society.
Holy shit, the video essay said society!
Yet still, most people play video games just to play video games. They're not looking for morals, politics, or particularly evocative experiences, and besides, gamers, they're neither the most socially proactive nor the most media literate bunch either. But that doesn't make them dumb, dense, stubborn, or stupid. I'm a gamer. I wouldn't describe myself as any of those things. We just don't like being lectured. We don't like being told what to do, or what to believe. We want to be able to carve our own path, make our own choices. We want to be able to enjoy one of the more unique traits that video games as a storytelling medium is able to offer. What we want, what we really want, is choice is never really something you would consider all that much when you're experiencing a story. Well, any choice beyond what to watch and when to watch it anyway. Point is, once a story gets going, you wouldn't normally have any control over it. You can't rewrite the pages, film your own scenes, or influence the outcome in any way at all, not unless you were, let's say, an actor or a writer for it. But that brings us to the argument, well, what would be so good about being able to shape a story yourself? After all, we've been enjoying stories for as long as they've existed without being able to affect the outcome, and that sure didn't spoil the experience. Sure, every now and then when you see a character do something stupid, you might go, "Oh, Bartholomew, you foolish vagabond, do you not see the error in your action? My, have I been the one to bequeath your misfortunes? I would find myself not in the perils you've brought upon yourself, but rather the warm bosom of triumph, for in such tribulations I would keep to my intellect, and look at me, I'm so smart and special, what happened to you could never happen to me, if only I could show the appropriate course of actions." Well, guess what, Slick? Now you can. Sex again to the magic of video games. Of course, it's not a bad thing at all that for the longest time the audience had absolutely no say in the outcome of a story. As a matter of fact, that's able to accomplish a lot of things that giving control would otherwise not, like, let's say, communicating a very specific message. But having choice in the matter of how a story goes by literally being able to control a character serves to make the experience all the more special, and people love that. They want to feel special when they're experiencing a story. People outright express or even subconsciously want to point at the characters and go, "Hey, just like me for real." They want to go, "Oh wow, I'm so smart, I figured out what this story is trying to say." And having choices makes that connection feel stronger, especially in an RPG with multiple endings, as your first time produces a very unique experience. But then again, one could argue that
choices? What choices? All we're doing is going down a preset order of possibilities that the developers made. And sure, there might be multiple endings, but that won't change the fact that those will always be the only endings, no matter what choices you make. And even lesser choices with the hundreds of RPGs with only one ending. So I ask you this, where's the freedom in that?
And to that I say, you don't know where a story is going the first time you experience it. And that is the major distinguishing factor between your role in the RPG versus, let's say, an actor on a stage play. You know what they say about all good things in life, your first time is the most special, wink wink. And it's these choices you make when you sit down to play an RPG for the first time that make it so special, as no matter what ending the author says is canon, whatever ending you get first will always be your ending, as it's a reflection of who you are. The world in an RPG would follow the consequences of all these choices you're making, and what are your choices if not a product of your personality? In Fallout New Vegas, for instance, the ending and stakes will always technically be the same. There's a final battle in a key strategic location which will determine who gets to control a region of post-apocalyptic USA. But it's the choices you made along the way which determines which of the factions in Fallout New Vegas gets that. Did you happen to enlist with the tax-loving, gunslinging, Mojave-patrolling Rangers of the New California Republic? Or perhaps you said, "Hail Kaiser, fuck taxes," and crucified every profligate you saw. Better yet, the other endings of not only the Mojave, but the characters and communities you interacted with along the way. New Vegas makes good work of keeping track of the consequences of your actions, which is really impressive given how little time it was actually developed. There's a neat little ending reel showcasing how you affected the characters' lives, whether you made it better, worse, or only now found out about their existence, because great googly moogly, there's so much to do in this game. And of course, we can't talk about all these choices without mentioning Undertale. Come on, you knew this was coming. To throw you some spoilers, but, you know, it's a 9-year-old game now, and, yeah, it's 9 years old. Undertale. It's 9 years old now. Undertale. 9 years old. Wow. That's 2015 for ya. Undertale. It's 9 years old now. Undertale. 9 years old. You know, the more I say it, it's not like the less it's gonna be true, but Undertale. 9 years old now. Undertale. 9 years old. People are generally knowledgeable of the 3 endings it has, but one of them is an umbrella term for over a dozen. The neutral endings, plural, constitute a diverse set of possibilities that accurately reflect your actions in the game. I'm not gonna go into detail with all of them, but they're largely determined by who you choose to spare or kill. For instance, did you know there's an ending where the murderous sexy robot Metaton becomes the new king? I bet you didn't know that, since it took people ages to actually care about the neutral endings, but then again, who could blame them? When the backseat gaming, the fandom, and the general attitude of the internet in 2015 to 2017, oh, it was vicious. But that experience is special to me partly because that's the very first ending I ever got. And it isn't the fact that these RPGs have these limited preset endings that one should be bothered about when debating about the nature of choices in video games. It's the fact that no other storytelling medium lets you have these different endings on a regular basis. You know, fanfiction sprouts from the what-if questions people ask themselves when they experience a story, even if those what-if questions always somehow happen to be sexually indulgent, needlessly violent, or some perverse combination of both. But the authors themselves, they're able to answer a lot of those questions when you have a story capable of having different endings, as no one would know these characters more than the author. Of course, having different endings isn't unique to RPGs, but rather it's a quality of video games as a storytelling medium as a whole, but I'm of the opinion that RPGs does multiple endings best because of the genre's heavy emphasis on developing the story. However, there's still RPGs with only one ending. How about those? Well, to that, I quote scripture from RP Jesus himself, Robert Toby F. Radiation Fox. There's something more important than reaching the end. Maybe where we got to isn't as important as how we got there. Back to Fallout New Vegas, your abilities in the game are determined by an order of stats which affect different skills. The main ones constitute Special, which stands for Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck. There is a mission that involves dealing with a hostage negotiation crisis with the NCR and the Great Khans. Now, the ending of this particular questline is always technically going to point you in the same direction, but you have options in getting there. Maybe you waltz right into this tense situation with a cool head, a smile full of glitter, and the biggest mouth you can muster to talk your way out of things. Or you go guns blazing, letting the bullets and bombs doing all the talking for you. Ah, but I still hear you arguing that's not a good example for a linear ending RPG. Fine then, let's talk about one that is. Pokemon Sapphire, the very first RPG I ever played, and no exaggeration in saying there's literally one ending to this game. You, child protagonist again, waltz right up to the Elite Four and Pokemon Champion after having to go through 8 labyrinthian gyms filled with questionable interior design, while having dealt with criminal syndicate shenanigans involving SeaWorld's biggest hit. With you, your team of 6 lovingly cared for murder pests that can have a range of abilities from blasting water like a pressure hose to summoning earthquakes at will. And you style on these grown adults with nothing but your strategic 10-year-old wit and enough spray bottles and pills to fill a drugstore. Or maybe even a few lava cookies sold by the grandma from Mad Chimney. Those were always my favorite. And although you can keep playing the game even after you've done all that, that's what most people recognize as the end. And you have so much agency in how you get there. Specifically what team of 6 murder pests you want to adopt for yourself. What abilities you want to give them, even down to their cute little nicknames. What other medium of storytelling lets you do that? Hell, you might even go, screw the story, I'm gonna live my own life, and effectively halt all progression while still playing the game. Spend your days fishing in Pacific Log, pimping out your personal home away from home in a tree, cave, or bush, child gambling, or winning beauty pageants with your murder pets. A bold personality, we know what that's code for, she's a bitch. Because in an RPG, the role in role-playing game isn't limited to what the story demands of you anymore. It can be whatever you choose for yourself. As, coming back to an earlier point, most people play video games specifically not to be reminded of reality. Sometimes they just want that silly old fun, so they pause the story for a while just to mess around. And having choices in deciding the pacing of the story, well, that serves to make the experience all the more special. A good RPG balances in making the player feel special by giving them all this power while still posing significant challenges in order to make them feel rewarded. So that for every end of the chapter, for every triumph, it feels earned. Earned not because you sat there and watched things happen, but you made things happen. You're free to define what motivates you to push the story forward in an RPG. And again, this isn't unique to RPGs as a genre, but rather a quality of video games as a medium, but the way it serves the story in an RPG elevates the storytelling beyond what other mediums are readily capable of. It's not that writing, film, or performance arts, it's not like any of them are incapable of what the RPG accomplishes. It's just that, number one, you have to put extra effort into making that happen, and number two, they serve different purposes that does not demand that the audience is granted freedoms. Because no matter how much freedom you're granted in a story, it will never actually surpass the authors. No matter how special the time you had experiencing the story, you will only ever have a partial say in it. Most of the time, you don't even get a say in it at all. Every story starts with someone who had an idea about the world, and they wanted to tell you how much that idea meant to them. So they make these fantastical stories, these fantastical worlds, in the hope that even the densest of people would listen. That's how storytelling was for the longest time. Authors telling us what they think of the world. But something exceptionally magical happened when we started using video games to tell a story. Something that I would claim has always been present in every single storytelling medium. It just took a bunch of pixels strung together to help us all realize that. As with the RPG, you're not just listening to someone talk about their ideas. As a matter of fact, you get to say your own ideas too. I had an English teacher who once said that one way to become immortal is to write a book. For in it will remain the very beliefs that made up who you are, as it's impossible to write a story without injecting a little of ourselves. Wouldn't that be a nice way to live forever? Generations you'd never meet would be able to listen to the words you strung together to say something about the world, and in effect, they'd be listening to you. Because, in actuality, a story is nothing more than the collection of thoughts and feelings of some authors, passed on through the mediums of different storytelling methods to reach an observer who not only listens to those very thoughts and feelings, but might just experience them too. Stories are interactions, after all, and first and foremostly, it's an interaction between the author and observer. But, if you're still having trouble buying that reasoning, I hope this little concept of engagement makes everything clear. Immersion, freedom, engagement. What all three of these qualities have in common is that none of them are one-sided. An author could bleed their heart and soul into a story, but if it never finds an audience, well, it'll be tough for them to see its worth. That's the interaction I'm talking about. Before you even read the first words of a story, that whole engagement starts with this conversation. I have something to say. I choose to listen. With everything afterwards being the natural steps as if holding a conversation. And before I tell you how RPGs do that engagement best, let's wrap everything up in a neat little bow. Immersion. You gotta have the audience care before anything else. Placing them in the world itself is gonna do that plenty. Freedom is, I'd say, like an extension of picking the kind of story you want, with the observer actively catering to their wants for more personalization. And finally, engagement, well, it's one thing to go through another person's thoughts and feelings. It's another thing to actually care about them, but it's a whole different ordeal entirely to make it actually stick with you. Every day, the brain is bombarded with one distraction or another, so what's gonna make these stories stick out? Simple. They make it personal. Engagement is your back and forth with the author. Kinda like listening to the elder around the campfire, or a kid getting read a bedtime story. I'm thinking that's the point of a lot of stories. They want you to learn something, anything. As while there's nothing wrong with a bit of fun to pass the time, you got a purpose-built organ thirsting for learning with its 86 billion neurons and all. It's nice to feed it every once in a while. And in a century bound to its attachment to technology, maybe it would take a bunch of pixels strung together for folks to listen. It's hard to have a back and forth with a story if it's just you. And I have no doubt that there have been novels and films that have fulfilled that. But RPGs, they make that engagement the standard. It's the standard in this kind of creative engagement for you to exchange ideas with the author and for their story to react accordingly to how they think of the world themselves. You can keep on butting heads with the author's ideas without ever speaking to them yourself. That immortal conversation not confined to the fleeting, ephemeral blink of a single lifetime, but a conversation that exists for as long as humanity allows it to exist. And I believe that RPGs do that conversation best. After all, a story has, is, and always will be an interaction between at least two people. And today, those two people were you and I. Because I had something to say, and thank you for choosing to listen. Ad astra, per aspera.